Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's very special event, Emerging Powers in Conflict Management, Lessons from Central Asia. My name is Alex Cooley. I'm Professor of Political Science at Barnard College and the Harriman Institute's Deputy Director for Social Sciences Programming, welcoming you here today, and I'll be the moderator. On behalf of the Harriman Institute and the Salzman Institute for War and Peace Studies, I'd like to welcome you to what I think is a very new, interesting, timely topic, and we have really some of the world's preeminent experts and scholars on this new and exciting topic here to share their views with us. At this time of the international management of internal armed conflicts is becoming a primary area of dispute in world politics, both in terms of Security Council politics, but more relevant to today, I think the kinds of values, norms, perspectives that we put on peacekeeping and peace building and post-conflict reconstruction. And so today we're going to explore some of these so-called illiberal emerging alternatives to the classic liberal paradigm. So we're very grateful that we have scholars to join us from far away, and I'll just briefly introduce them in the order that they will present. So our two panelists for the day, first is David Lewis, who's Senior Lecturer in Politics at the University of Exeter in the UK. David is an accomplished researcher and academic, previously at the University of Bradford and also of the International Crisis Group. So he has both the policy perspective and the academic perspective. There he led research projects in Central Asia and Sri Lanka. And his current research focuses on the impact of geopolitical change on international peace and conflict, and he's co-investigator on this rising powers and conflict management in Central Asia. Also has done a lot of work on new modes and styles of authoritarianism in post-Soviet Eurasia. So David will present his paper on illiberal conflict management, modes of conflict management. Then our second presenter will be John Heathershaw here, who is Associate Professor in International Relations, also at the University of Exeter, and he's Principal Investigator on the ESRC research project, Rising Powers in Conflict Management in Central Asia. And John will present some more of the Central Asian-related, I think, findings from the project. Then we have two discussants. First, Severine Autesserre, my distinguished colleague, Barnard College, who's assistant professor. Very soon her title will change to associate professor, recently tenured. And she's an expert in peace building, conflict management studies, and of course in sort of the constructivist tradition of looking at norms and frames and analysis in politics. So she will offer her comparative thoughts. And then we're also very lucky to be joined by Christoph Zerker, who's a professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, one of the world's premier institutions for the study of peace building. And his research is diverse, and his teaching interests include conflict, peace building, international development. He has had a focus on the former Soviet Union, especially Russia, the Caucasus, Central Asia, led numerous research projects, but he's also well familiar with former Yugoslavia, and I believe he's doing some new work on Afghanistan now too, on post-war reconstruction. So two ideal presenters, two ideal discussants. David, the floor is yours. And just a reminder, at the end of the presentations, we'll have an open mic session so you can ask questions. And just a reminder to everyone, because we are being videotaped and this will be digitally archived and go on the Harriman website, everything here is on the record. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Alex. Thanks for that great introduction, and thanks very much for the invitation. Really good to be back, and as usual, you've put together a really fascinating panel, and we really look forward to some responses. I should say this is very much work in progress. These are ideas we're trying to discuss and generate, so we really look forward to your feedback, both critical and even perhaps otherwise. I'm going to do an introduction of some of the ideas that are in this paper around authoritarian conflict management, discuss whether that's a paradigm that we can discuss within the broader literature on peace building and conflict resolution. And then John will talk a little more about our project in broader terms. So I wanted to start, although this is really a discussion about Central Asia, I want to start far away in Sri Lanka, where, as Alex said, I spent a year working for the International Crisis Group. And much of this, this sort of notion of an authoritarian alternative to the liberal peace comes from this very clear distinction that you had in Sri Lanka, and that I saw the transition of, if you like, on the cusp of 2006, 2007, was a shift from an almost classical liberal peace process overseen by the Norwegians, a negotiation between the government and the Tamil Tigers, and its gradual decline into what turned out to be a very brutal military counterinsurgency program, in which the LTT eventually were completely defeated, and where you now have, I think it's fair to say, a much more stable post-conflict environment, although with still many problems within the country, of course. I think that process of transition from one type of approach to the conflict to another has been one that has been rather under-examined, and I think many of the people who are involved in that peace process still haven't almost come to terms with what exactly happened during that period. So that sets some of the background to why I got interested in this in the first place, and I think it remains a fascinating example of the kind of approach to conflict that I'm discussing. Central Asia, which is really the focus of our project, our research project, funded by the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK, provides lots more examples of this kind of approach to conflict. John will go through some of this, but we've been looking at conflicts in localized armed conflicts in Tajikistan, in Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan to a certain extent, looking at the ways that these governments, most of them broadly non-democratic in their approaches, have tried to control these outbreaks of localized violence, right? The kind of mechanisms they've used. And rather than just looking at these conflicts and the responses to them in terms of, for example, human rights abuses, of which there are many, or in terms of a paradigm of security and terrorism, which is also another frame in which Central Asia often fits, we try to understand a little more about the internal mechanisms. Why do these governments take particular policies and not take others? We're trying to get down, if you like, into the micro processes of what actually happens on the ground, and not simply see these as rather simplistic, just uses of violence against internal opponents. Just want to flag up, as we go through this, three sort of academic contexts, perhaps, in which this discussion is taking place. At least three literatures, perhaps, that we are trying to engage with in various ways. One literature is the set of academic discussions, which you're probably very familiar with, related to the liberal peace, and the subsequent discussion of how to cope with, if you like, the failure of the liberal peace, right? The idea that the liberal peace, all those interventionist peace-building programs based essentially on liberal views of how conflict should be resolved, have reached a state of some crisis within the international system. Either they've converted into more or less non-democratic post-conflict situations, Rwanda, Tajikistan, etc., or they've often collapsed back into conflict, South Sudan, the latest one, to face that kind of problem, or they seem to be stuck in this unending sort of international paradigm and unable to develop a sustainable domestic peace. And so there's been a lot of discussion, of course, in the academic environment about how we understand this. How do we find a new paradigm to understand what's going on in conflicts around the world? And there's been a lot of rich literature and interesting discussion around ideas, for example, of hybrid peace, post-liberal peace. And this discussion is an attempt to engage with that. It's critiquing, if you like, that hybrid notion of peace and suggesting there's actually a much more and almost much simpler idea here going on, which is certainly a post-liberal peace, but also an illiberal peace. In other words, a peace process that is trying to achieve stabilization based not on some interaction hybridity with Western values and norms, but asserting a totally different set of norms, a totally different set of values on its own terms. It does engage with the outside and with the external, but it does so very much on its own terms and does not compromise on the core ideas of what it sees the appropriate approach to conflict being. So that's one literature that we like to engage with and talk about, and I think it's a very interesting and rich discussion going on at the moment in the academic environment. The second, also a very interesting area that I think is becoming very, very live in the academic debate, is these different waves, we might say, of scholarship on international norms. We're very interested in the process whereby elites and states and indeed all sorts of communities and actors in Central Asia develop their own sets of norms and start to promote those, have agency, in other words, on their own behalf. I think what we've seen is a real shift away from the kind of scholarship we had in the late 90s and early 2000s, indeed still see, which is about the dissemination of nice ideas, right, about democratization, liberal values, from these sort of normative centers, you might say, down the road in the UN or in Vienna, the OSCE, or these sort of very well-meaning, Scandinavian capitals that develop ideas about the appropriate responses to conflict and how to build peace. And I think we've now seen a real shift. Mitav Acharya has done some really interesting, great work on new ideas of agency and norms, the idea that peripheral states, if you like, within the international system are not simply the passive recipients, but are developing their own policies based on their own normative values. And so this is also an attempt to take seriously the idea that states, governments, and agents may have their own normative conceptions of what is good and what is an appropriate response to conflict, which may well be based not on liberal values, but we should nevertheless take them seriously, even if at the same time we may want to critique them. And a third set of literatures, which I think John will also comment on a little later on, is a very contested idea of rising powers. Alex mentioned the extent to which this is a critical issue now in the Security Council. How you respond to conflict internationally is a key determinant, really, of the way that the international order is changing. We've seen it in Syria, obviously, we see it in Ukraine, we saw it in Sri Lanka as well. And the role of Russia and China in this is absolutely critical, not only in terms of their own domestic responses to conflict, but the role they've played in various other conflicts in legitimizing non-liberal responses to conflicts around the world. And certainly what Russians would call the relative success of their policy in Chechnya, we can discuss what that means, has produced not just their own domestic idea about what the appropriate response to conflict should be, but also an idea that this is exportable. I saw a report recently saying Russian advisors had gone out to Nigeria to try and help them with their counterinsurgency. Again, we can discuss how good an idea that sounds. But certainly this is not simply a sort of defensive mode anymore. It's about suggesting that this is an alternative, and a really valid alternative that might be adopted in other countries. So that's the sort of academic context that I want to put in. Now I just want to go through some of the ways of trying to understand what might be generalizable across some of these cases. I'm a little hesitant about calling this a model, but nevertheless something that we see being common to different cases where this kind of authoritarian conflict management style is being used. And there's lots of different ways of trying to discuss this, of course. I've tried to divide it up into three broad domains where states, I think, are very active in trying to manage conflict. One of those is discourse, trying to define and give meaning to events and to different actors to provide a certain amount of legitimacy and to delegitimize others. Second area, I think, is space, which is looking at space in the sense of something produced through political and social interaction and preventing rebels from controlling space in all sorts of ways. And thirdly, political economy, looking at political economy not simply as trying to improve the economy to remove poverty, if you like, as a basis for conflict, but using political economy as a weapon of control, as a way of removing resources from rebels and transferring them to clientelist, pro-government mechanisms of political economy. So I'll go through each of those with a couple of examples in each case. In terms of discourse, the classic liberal model of conflict resolution is one in which you have negotiation. It's negotiation that is supposed to bring in different voices and try to resolve difference in all sorts of different ways. Now, we may discuss, of course, the extent to which liberal peace in reality has produced this. Clearly, in all sorts of ways, you often see hegemonic discourses and dominant narratives produced by liberal peace-building processes themselves. We discuss what the difference here might be. But in a broad sort of idealistic view, you see a very different approach, a dialogic approach, if you like, within liberal approaches to conflict resolution, as opposed to a monologic, a top-down, univocal idea within an authoritarian mode of governance, which provides only one voice, only one single solution to the conflict. Other actors in this process are delegitimized. And this way of using language and discourse as a way of legitimizing the state and delegitimizing all other actors is very important. Again, it doesn't only happen in what we might call authoritarian modes of conflict management, but it is extended here to a much wider array of actors than you see in any other conflict context. So in Sri Lanka, for example, there's a real effort to exclude international actors in particular. Liberal peace building, of course, is almost defined by its internationalization of conflict. In Sri Lanka, the main process was to domesticize this conflict, to put boundaries around it, to exclude, in particular, the Norwegians, and instead to legitimize the state as the sole arbiter of the meaning of the conflict, of the appropriate response to the conflict, and the key actor in responding to the conflict. And so in Sri Lanka, we have this constant discursive campaign. Apologies to any Norwegians in the audience. I know Norwegians are normally very popular people around the world. In Sri Lanka, unfortunately, that's not the case. So these are some of the politer things that were said about Norway and its intervention in the conflict there. And this is a way, of course, of trying to delegitimize all sorts of external actors. One was about delegitimizing external interveners in the conflict, and the other approach was to delegitimize internal civil society and non-governmental organizations. And again, in the same way as here, by linking them to so-called terrorists, and in that way clearing the field for only a select group of legitimate actors to take part in the conflict. And of course, this is partly achieved through these kind of discursive constructs and the kind of language that is used. It's also achieved through violence, right? So discourse is marshaled through physical pressure and physical killing also of journalists, media actors, and other producers of discourse in various ways. In terms of Central Asia, we see this in Tajikistan, another classic shift from the sort of multi-actor approach to conflict resolution into a very singular approach in which all the opposition groups have gradually been excluded from a power-sharing agreement and have now reached the point where they're completely excluded from Parliament and are even facing the threat of being banned by the government. So this gradual shift from multi-actor approaches to single-actor approaches, multi-vocal approaches to univocal approaches is also classic in Tajikistan as well. And again, this sense of hegemonic discourse being used to label opponents in particular ways, terrorists being the obvious and most easy label to use. And our colleague Ed Lemon has a very good article on this in Central Asian Affairs, which I'd strongly recommend. He's got some interesting quotes in there with the way that the government refused to negotiate with different groups in a series of conflicts in 2010, 2011, and in each case, of course, labeled them as terrorists, regardless really of what they'd done, as a way of delegitimizing any calls for dialogue and for negotiation. Just a third moment about discourse, which is about trying to define the causes of conflict, the meaning of conflict. Why does a conflict break out? And I think here it's quite interesting to look at this in terms of the classic discussion around greed and grievance as the sources of conflict. And in this debate, authoritarian states are all very much on the side of Oxford economist Paul Collier, who argues, of course, that it doesn't really matter what grievances people have or what concerns they have in life. It's really just about whether they have the opportunity to rebel. And if you want to prevent war, you need to prevent rebels from getting access to economic, political, and social resources. And so in this sense, this kind of conflict management is about denial of access to resources in all sorts of ways, denial to political space, denial to military resources, obviously, and also denial to economic funds that could fund some kind of rebellion. So discourse is used as a way of defining the causes of conflict, of excluding the idea that conflict is about grievance, and therefore legitimizing a particular government response to conflict in the long term. And just to pick on another example, this is kind of classic Chinese discourse around conflict in Xinjiang, always separates the conflict out from any kind of potential grievances of the Uyghur people and defines it instead simply as a criminal act, a terrorist act, which has no basis in an ongoing issue between the central authorities and ethnic minority peoples, and therefore cannot be resolved through the classic liberal idea of providing more autonomy, providing more cultural space for ethnic minorities. Second point that, the second point of sort of second domain, I suppose we can say, in which I think authoritarian political orders operate in terms of trying to manage conflict, is through controlling space, through controlling and producing different types of space. Liberal approaches, again, in a sort of classic idealistic sense, see space as a neutral ground in which different representatives of different political ideas can come together. This is the whole basis, of course, of a sort of a parliamentary space, is somewhere where different parties can debate. So in that sense, liberal peace building, again in theory, tries to open up spaces in which those kind of negotiations can take place. Think of all the different places where peace processes happen. They're very carefully designed to produce and support that kind of conflict resolution process. In an authoritarian approach, it's very different. Space is never neutral. Space is always something that is either controlled by us or it's controlled by them. Space is a resource like anything else in an ongoing conflict. Space is something you can extract resources from. We know about that major discussion in literature on conflict. But it's also a space where you can produce your own normative order. You can show the kind of space and state that you might like to produce. In Sri Lanka, Tamil Tigers produced their own de facto state, which demonstrated the kind of alternative order that they might be able to offer to the population. Of course, it goes without saying that these kind of authoritarian approaches are very much opposed to any kind of territorial autonomy. This, again, is a classic liberal approach that suggests that providing autonomy will resolve the grievances that underlie conflict. If you deny that grievances are there, then clearly that's not an appropriate response. And all sorts of other spaces get closed down. Most interestingly, recently we've seen a lot of attempts by Central Asian states to close down the space of diaspora politics through assassinations, surveillance of diaspora communities, and so on and so forth. Again, it's a space that's not controlled easily by their own governments at home. So one approach is to control space, to limit the space available for any kind of opposition to emerge. But it's also worth thinking about space in terms of producing alternative spaces, right? Space is something that is produced through the built environment, through monuments, through symbolism. Just come back from a trip to Central Asia, to Astana and Osh, both cities which in various ways are producing a new architecture which reflects a particular type of political identity produced by an authoritarian political order. Of course, this is well known in the literature. This is a statue of Manas that's been built since a conflict in Osh in 2010 as a way of marking out this territory as quintessentially Kyrgyz. Manas is a famous Kyrgyz hero, and this suggests that this space is defined in terms of one particular national identity, and is not a space of different identities that might be competing. So producing space has become a very important part of a post-conflict reconstruction environment, and of course the way that you produce that space defines the kind of peace-building process that goes on afterwards. Grozny, the ultimate example really of a city that's been produced under Ramzan Kadyrov as an almost entirely new identity for the Chechen people, right? Producing an idea of post-conflict reconstruction, the aim of which is not to produce a memory of conflict and some kind of reconciliation, but to forget about the conflict almost entirely. Kadyrov had this program, a building program called No Traces of War, the idea that the new construction would obliterate any sense that there had been a conflict with Russia, and therefore you now have these great buildings along Putin Avenue, which represent an alternative reality, we might say, that forgets there ever was a conflict there altogether. And there's a whole process there of memory and forgetting, of course, that we might discuss. And just finally, on political economy, it's very important and very interesting ways in which these states have begun to use the political economy not simply as a way of pumping in money to produce, if you like, more popular support for the government, but doing so in a very specific way through these patron-client systems that augment the existing political control. Very nice article on Chechnya recently discussing the process of buying peace, essentially. In other words, using funds to buy off particular elites and construct a new political order in Chechnya that is essentially based on federal funding flowing through formal and informal channels and negating any possibility of an alternative political rebel movement emerging. And again, you can see this in other parts of the world. Same happened in Tajikistan, where again, many of these conflicts really revolve around control of resources, and the resolution of them is very much about putting the resources under the control of figures that are loyal to the central government. So just to conclude, there's lots of questions that arise from this discussion, I think, but the argument really is that distinct from liberal peace building, there is this alternative approach to conflict that I think we can call something like authoritarian conflict management. It's distinct in the sense that it has very, very different processes, very different norms underlying it, and I think in most cases very different outcomes. Violence and coercion is an integral part of this. I think it's important to say it's not just about violence, right? It's not just about coercion. And violence is not the aim. Violence is a means to achieve these other things. In other words, to control discourse, to control space. In this very absolute way, you need a high level of violence and coercion to back you up. But it also often includes quite a high level of popular support. Look at the popular support for these campaigns in Sri Lanka or in Chechnya, among the Russian people, among Sinhalese in Sri Lanka. These are very much majoritarian support for these kind of top-down, if you like, peacemaking in counterinsurgency programs. So there's obviously lots of questions here you might discuss, which are, is this peace at all? Can we define this as peace? Is it sustainable? Is it something that actually really gives only short-term sort of pacification? And can it really survive in an international system in which nevertheless liberal norms remain pretty much embedded within so much of the international order? So I really look forward to any feedback you have.
Great, thanks. John.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks for putting this panel together. and to Christophe and Severine for participating. I'm going to present a bit about the project in general, so you've got a sense of what we're doing. I should emphasize we are very much midway through this. We started in September 2012. We run to September 2016, and we still have field work going on. David has actually just come back from meeting a couple of our researchers working in the field right now. So there's preliminary conclusions. And I really want to focus on this question of what rising powers are doing here, because we've spent a lot of time over the last year or so thinking very much about localized dynamics and some of the kind of things David was raising in terms of, local manifestations of authoritarian conflict management, but I'm very much interested in what kind of dynamic you get between two more or less authoritarian or semi-authoritarian states where you have a so-called rising power. And as I'm going to say in a moment, I think it's problematic to think of a rising power as a particular kind of actor, but better to think of it actually as a sort of relationship between a great power, if you like, to use a more classical term, and a sort of local client state within a particular region. So there's relational dynamics we need to pick up here. So what I'm going to talk about a bit in the latter part of my presentation is trying to think about how do we really do that? How do we think about Russia and Central Asia in particular, the example of that? So just to introduce the project, first of all, we've got quite a large team, and you see David and I here. Also Nick McGoran, who's a political geographer at the University of Newcastle. I still haven't changed that slide, David, with your previous employment on. No, David really is at Exeter now with me, so I'm not trying to expel him to another institution. But we're also working with a UK-based civil society organisation for studying conflict and conflict management, which is called Safer World. But the full fieldwork team is people working on short-term basis, but actually have been involved in the project, coming to meetings and meeting in the UK, and also meeting together in the field over quite a long period of time. So I mentioned David meeting with colleagues in Osh recently. Ed Lemon, who David mentioned and quoted in his presentation, was also part of that team. So, publications beginning to come out from that group. And we have an international advisory board as well. So part of this was also to say this is not just a sort of Western endeavour to create a research project and proceed, but also to bring in Russian and Chinese voices onto the International Advisory Board, and a US voice, which is Alex, who's part of the advisory board, and Central Asian members too. So there's an attempt here as well to begin to start sort of raising questions, at least, if not influencing policy, raising questions for policy. This is first and foremost an academic research project which seeks conceptual innovation as well as empirical findings, but we do want to have a conversation in a policy domain too. So we're kind of embarking from a question around why has armed conflict actually been limited in Central Asia since the early 1990s, and part of that is how it has been managed or suppressed by regimes. There might be certain cases of violence which provide reference points for us over the last 10 years. Outbreaks of rebellion such as Andijan in 2005, the interethnic violence in Osh 2010, which is one of our cases, our first case, outbreaks of violence between the state and former civil war commanders in Tajikistan and political economic actors really over 2009 to 2011, and again shadow criminal groups who have a regional identity in Horog in 2012. But this conflict has been limited. One of the challenges here, I think, is where David raised the sort of paradigmatic case of Sri Lanka of this. So that's a major civil war, which these armed conflicts we're looking at are minor and not of that kind. So there may be a difference here in terms of the intensity of the armed conflict which we're looking at. And it might be that some of these things are more effective in minor armed conflict contexts, or differently effective in a different way, rather. So just to highlight those case studies, Andijan is pretty much impossible to study. There are various ways of doing it but it would be not comparable to our other cases. So we've settled on these sort of more recent ones of Osh, the Rash Valley in Tajikistan, and Horog. For those of you who don't know Central Asia, in Osh we had ethnic violence between Kyrgyz and Uzbeks. At least it had an ethnic character to it, but there was considerable dynamics of business, and also where economic dispossession was crucial, but also something that we're exploring in our research, where the particular relationships between minority groups within particular regions of the state was important. So violence didn't take place everywhere. There was places where Uzbeks were relatively safe in southern Kyrgyzstan. And so what we're looking at is why did things hold and be relatively less in violence there than they were in other parts of southern Kyrgyzstan. The Rash Valley in Tajikistan is a place which has seen intermittent violence and is a paradigmatic case in Central Asia, I think, for some of this control of space and discourse that David was talking about. It is a region where there was a lot of violence in the later part of the civil war in Tajikistan. Tajikistan had a civil war from 1992 to 1997, which has always been somewhat peripheral to the Tajik state, and where there's always been a potential of rebellion and independent former civil war commanders who retained some autonomy from the central state. And so the violence has often been about that. It's been about seeking to control those people. And then the third conflict in Horog is an interesting one, because again, I think space here is really important, where you have a sort of regional autonomy claim, which is underlying and is rarely made public. But there is a very important political economy dimension to that, where there's a struggle, and it certainly appears in 2012 when the violence erupted. This was the initial catalyst for that. There's a struggle over who controls the trafficking routes of sort of drugs out of Afghanistan. So you'll gather from that these conflicts are different. They're minor, and in that none of them have cost more than 500 or 600 lives, but they have a different character to them, and there's different types of dynamics. But I think they all demonstrate some features of authoritarian conflict management. So that map's a little bit misleading because it's a northern distribution network, but it highlights at least that what's going on in Central Asia is not of no concern at all to great powers or even indeed rising powers, and highlights the presence of Russia and China on Central Asia's borders. So there is a local context to how states and local actors engage in conflict, but there's also overlaying that a global context.
Do you just want to say to the audience what the Northern Distribution Network is?
Sorry, yeah. That's it. It is the distribution network that the United States set up from about 2009 to supply the US troops, NATO forces in Afghanistan through Central Asian states. And there's a whole discussion we could have around that and how that involves certain kind of alliances with Central Asian states, certain payoffs indeed, to keep that sort of the support of those Central Asian states for that activity. But our interest here is primarily in Russia and China as so-called rising powers, and how their presence in the region affects what might be going on. I think it's difficult to get fully at that and the place they have in conflict management. So that objective there is the second one. A wider project addresses quite a lot in terms of the approach of Western actors as well as rising powers, and then looking at the practices of conflict management. And the view is to offer and develop a new conceptual relationship for what's going on. I think we have an interest as well in conflict management and state formation. Thanks, Alex. And what this gets at, and what David's work I think helps us do, is by thinking about space and discourse in conflict management, you can see how all that also that's integral to how relatively young states are forming and are still forming. Okay, so I haven't got too much time. It's quite a challenge to introduce the project briefly because it is quite large. But just to say something about rising powers and what this means for Russia in Central Asia, as briefly as I can. I like using the term BRICS without foundations. BRICS is an institutional form now, and there has been summits of the BRICS of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But I think it's useful not to try and identify a particular kind of actor here, because there is a great deal of variation of them as states and their positions in their regions and globally. But there is a discourse which, first of all, reflects a certain amount of disquiet, I think primarily in the West, about possible relative Western decline via the other states. It also reflects struggles over global economic resources and the form and content of international institutions. But I think what the real interesting thing is to get at is a new kind of what's often called multipolar international relations, but we're understanding that as a sort of decentered set of relations where states act not simply in a unitary fashion, but often in a multiple way, and a post-colonial dimension where often so-called rising powers have their particular strengths in their former colonial regions, and that's certainly true of Russia's relations to the former Soviet states. So how do we understand these relations as being constituted? We're focusing on relations. We're taking more or less a practice-based approach, which also includes thinking about discourse, as David introduced as a form of practice. We're looking at relations which are centred as well as decentered, so there are claims for central capacity and activity. There are attempts to develop strategy centrally, but we're also talking about multiple state actors coming out of, say, Russia or China. In a relational sense, we're thinking about the fact that rising powers are only powers insofar as they have local actors. I think there's a couple of dimensions I'd like to pick up on here, and these are post-colonial ideas which are useful to us in getting at this. What James C. Scott calls metis, localized practices, coping mechanisms, practical knowledge, may be a better term than what's sometimes called corruption. And in this context, what might be corruption, what might be payments made locally, can be functional, not dysfunctional, in some of the ways I think David was starting to hint at. But also a dynamic here of mimicry, and that's a very, we're using that in the post-colonial sense of what that means. Post-colonial states often mimic their former colonial powers, but they do so in a way of sort of attracting to and reflecting these deep, long-standing connections, but also recoiling from. And that's a dynamic which we could sort of pick up a little bit. So just to summarise briefly on Russia in Central Asia. I realise I'm going over time, Alex, I'm sorry. I've bitten up for more than I can chew in trying to just present this in 10 minutes, I think. So this is just based on a little bit of preliminary research by one of our team that Catherine and I, who's in the audience, put together in a paper. Interviews with 25 political and cultural elites looking at how Kyrgyz and Tajik political and cultural elites understand Russia's role, and looking also at Russia's self-presentation. So presenting itself as a great power and highly active in trying to think about the development of Russian soft power. So Russian cooperation groups, Russian world, civil society organizations, really, we call them in a Western context, but an attempt to promote Russia. But there's a certain amount of ambivalence in the response to this by Central Asian political and cultural elites. We got some great quotes, which I won't go into because I guess don't really have time, but lots of quotes about the sheer power and importance of Russian media, for example, in Central Asia, it being better, actually, but also far more ubiquitous in the region than local news. That Putin is such an authoritative source, and Central Asian political and cultural elites are probably likely to spend more time listening to his pronouncements than those of their presidents. But a certain ambivalence about this particular attempt to project Russian soft power. Cynical remarks about Ruski Mir, one of these groups, and how it probably doesn't have any sort of duration to it. We see a lot of mimicry in Central Asia in terms of the Eurasian Economic Union. We could have a conversation about various other areas where Central Asian states appear to mimic Russian forms. Lots of examples of that. And some really important stuff in the use of corruption certainly by Russia and China in their business relations and investments in Central Asia, and how that in itself is a really important form of engagement. Effectively, by corruption is in a way a form of privatizing public goods, states' investments, which then go out into payments for individuals and constituencies within a state, and a way of kind of decentering political economic relations, because that's not a state-to-state relation, but it's a relationship where multiple actors within Russia and, say, Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan are gaining from that. Okay, so very briefly to finish.
Finish up.
Okay. There is a sense in which this isn't just about an externality for Russia. It's also a need for Russia to perform as a rising power in order to claim and to demonstrate its state strength, which is really quite questionable in Russia. You know, the extent to which Russian action is a reflection of the strength of the Putin regime as opposed to the Russian state is certainly open to question. But that is limited, and much of it is in the realm of soft power, which might be quite surprising for people if we view Russia from its actions, say, in supporting the rebels in Donbass over the last 18 months, and some of the sort of maybe Western views of Russia today. And I think also there's a debate that can be had on this, but in the Central Asian context and in the conflict management context, certainly, there's a lack of a centered, that is, singular Moscow voice, consistent and strategic deployment of military or diplomatic power. So we see some uncertainty, some ambivalence about engagement. And I think the big question for us is, when we look at China in these terms, as we will, how similar or dissimilar is China is its engagement in Central Asia? Does it demonstrate some of these things too?
Great.
Thanks very much for that, John. Okay, so let's move to the discussants to talk about both the conceptual and theoretical approach here, and also about some of the regional approach. So first up, Severine Autesserre.
Thanks, Alex. Is this working? Yep. Okay, fantastic. So thanks so much for inviting me, Alex, to comment on this project. It's really fascinating work. I'm glad I had the opportunity. So I got to read the papers before coming here and then listen to the presentation, and that was super, super interesting. So in my comments, I'm going to focus mostly on John's presentation and John's paper, but I'll also touch, on David's presentation and paper, but I'll also touch on John's presentation. So I think the starting point for the project is right on. The study of non-liberal, non-Western approaches to peace building is really a topic that is innovative and that is extremely important. There is very, very little research on non-Western peace building, as John and David mentioned in their presentations. And as up to now, as far as I know, nobody has yet theorized non-liberal, non-Western peace building. And the very few attempts at theorization that we have never been as thorough and as insightful as the one that we see in this project. So I think that's already a major contribution that has to be noted. And it's also a project that is important not only for those of us who work on peace building and on conflict management, but also for everybody who works on international relations, because the project has a very clear focus on non-Western approaches to international relations. And that was actually, I think, clearer in the papers that we read than in the presentation. But there is a very clear focus on non-Western approaches to international relations, which is, again, an emerging body of research in international relations and a very important topic of discussions today. And that's most obvious in the paper that John and Catherine wrote for today. So to me, the big contribution of what we heard today, and especially of David's paper and presentation, is that it really provides a very helpful framework to analyze and to understand authoritarian conflict management. The focus on discourse, space, and economics is right on. And it's also quite insightful. So I don't work on Central Asia. I'm not the region specialist on this panel. I work on Africa. And so when I was reading the paper, it really enabled me to rethink what I know about African conflict management in the places that I work. So it enabled me to rethink and to understand better the practice of conflict management in Rwanda, for example, and the practice of conflict management in certain parts of Congo. And the project makes a very important contribution to our understanding of conflict and post-conflict situation, because authoritarian conflict management, as described in the project, is indeed much more widespread than what we would think before starting to hear the presentation and to listen to the project. And that's really one of the big contributions, is giving us a framework to think about it and enabling us to recognize that this is a practice that is much more widespread than what is the current focus of academic literature on conflict management, which is the focus on liberal practices of conflict management. And again, when we look at the literature on authoritarian conflict management, there is often a lot of biases. And there is a lot of holes and a lot of gaps that these papers, again, help correct. So because the findings have such a wide applicability, I would really encourage the project team, and especially David, but really the entire project team, to think beyond Central and Southeast Asia. So I understand you got funding for this part of the world, but there are funders also who are interested in other parts of the world. And that would, I think, increase the comparative purchase of the project and the applicability of the project. So what we saw during the presentation, and if you read the paper, that's what you're going to see. You're going to see a lot of the examples are drawn from Central Asia and from Southeast Asia. And there are a couple of mentions of other places, other parts of the world, but it's really the focus is really regionally on Central and Southeast Asia. But again, you can talk much more about other parts of the world that have authoritarian conflict management. So we'll take one case, Rwanda. Because to me, when I was reading the paper, I had Rwanda in mind all the time. And Rwanda is a really great case for the study of authoritarian conflict management, because to me, it's a case of what I call surprising peace, which is something that I'm currently studying. What I mean is that Rwanda has all of the conditions that for political scientists and anthropologists and social scientists, we have identified as conditions leading to violence. So for example, Rwanda has a history of violence. It has a recent genocide. It has violent neighbors. It has poverty. And I could go on and on and on. And yet in Rwanda, you have surprisingly little overt violence. And Rwanda is also much richer than the neighboring countries. And everything that you mentioned in the paper describe Rwanda perfectly. So there is a mention in the paper, not in the presentation, but in the paper there is a mention of Rwanda in the section on discourse, saying that in Rwanda the government used discourse to delegitimize the rebel groups by saying that these rebel groups propagate a genocide ideology. So that's true. But also the use of space. If you go to Kigali, the capital of Rwanda, when the pictures that you were showing reminded me a lot of the new buildings that have appeared in Kigali in recent years. So the use of space and the control of space that you describe in the presentation and in the paper is exactly what is going on in Rwanda. The analysis of economics is also right on. So, and I'm sure that people who know of other cases outside of Central Asia would be able also to find very clear parallels between your analysis of authoritarian conflict management in Central Asia and authoritarian conflict management in many other parts of the world. And so, thinking about these places that I know, Rwanda, Congo, and other countries where the authorities use authoritarian conflict management, that raises two questions for me. Two questions that, again, might be interesting to explore in the broader project if you haven't already started to do so. The first one is, why does authoritarian conflict management work in certain cases and not in others? So, for example, what does it manages to decrease or eliminate violence in places like Rwanda, but not in places like Congo? And we really see that the Congolese government is trying to use the same kind of strategies, but the effect on violence is completely different. In Rwanda, you have a relative absence of physical violence. In Congo, you don't. So why do we get such different results with the attempts of using the same tactics? And second, I wonder what's the role of violence in the framework that you have. So there were mentions of violence in the presentation, and I thought that violence was more emphasized in the presentation than it was in the paper. In the paper, there are a couple of mentions of violence here and there, but in the places that I know that are the theaters of authoritarian conflict management, fear of violence, the threat of violence, and the use of violence is really omnipresent. There is killing, torturing, kidnapping of rebel groups or suspected rebel groups and political opponents. Ordinary people live in fear of the police, fear of the army, fear of the security services. The case of Rwanda, again, is really interesting because it's not only the use of violence within the territory, but the exporting of violence as well to neighboring countries, and notably to Congo. So I understand that the way you developed the framework was in reaction to the existing literature that places such an emphasis on violence and that views violence as the only characteristics of authoritarian conflict management. So I understand where you're coming from, and I understand why the project is placing such emphasis on non-violent means of conflict management and on discourse and space and economics. But I wonder, in trying to correct the bias in the existing literature, if you may have gone a bit too far and overlooked a little bit the role that violence plays, because I think it does play as central a role as the three other elements that you mentioned in the framework. And as you revise the framework and as you continue the project, you may also want to think about the tension that, to me, runs through the paper, and that's really for David's paper and presentation. So the paper is written as a programmatic exploratory document, and the presentation that John made was also, we're in the middle of this research project, and we're basically starting something new. And it's really a call for further research that opens new areas of research, and that in itself is fantastic contribution again. But I'm still unclear on the actual goal of the research. I understand that you don't want, and it was very clear in David's paper, you don't want to make any claims about peace and conflict resolution as we understand in the liberal sense. And you have very sound theoretical justifications for that in the paper. And so as a result, in the presentation and in the paper, there isn't any kind of policy recommendations or policy prescriptions. And I understand it's a deliberate decision, at least at that stage in the project. But at the same time, the way John situated the project in the presentation and the way David situated the project also in the paper, it's situated in the context of search for alternatives to the liberal peace. And Jen mentioned that also the project is meant to contribute to the policy world. So to me, there is a tension between the objectives of the paper and presentation, which is very theoretical. We're contributing to theory, and we don't want to do problem solving. We are good critical theorists. And the broader debates to which you want to contribute, which are very much problem solving and very much oriented toward providing policy recommendations. And finally, I have a question that may be a useful suggestion on how to further expand the paper and the broader project. So I wonder if the everyday practices of authoritarian conflict management are the same or whether they are different from the everyday practice of liberal peace building on the ground. And I really mean what the work that you're doing on the ground, away from capital cities, away from headquarters. And so when I say everyday practices, I mean the everyday routines, the practices, the narratives of the interveners themselves, the international conflict managers, so the kind of thing that I've studied in my new book, Peaceland, but also the everyday practices of local populations, the kind of thing that Roger McGinty is exploring in his new research on everyday peace. So that might be a useful next step to take in the project, looking at these two kinds of everyday practices and saying whether or not they are different from liberal everyday practices. Because again, what I've seen in my research is that you may have completely different paradigms and frameworks, but what happens at the micro level may be actually extremely similar. So that may be also another way to contribute to the debate on the liberal piece. So to wrap up, I think my time is almost up, Alex. So to wrap up, it's a fascinating project. It has already contributed a lot to our understanding of war and peace, not only in the region of interest of the Harriman Institute, but I think it really has the potential to contribute to our understanding of war and peace in many other parts of the world. And so I'm glad I had the opportunity to learn about it, and I really look forward to reading more from the project that will emerge from the project. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Severine. Christoph, please join the conversation.
Thank you. All right. So let me start with saying that, as Severine did, that when I read your two papers, I found myself, at every second paragraph, I was yes, and indeed, and I totally agree. And it was one of these this really nice experience when you find this, you find yourself in agreement with something new and interesting. So I tremendously enjoyed that. Your presentation were a little bit different from the papers, so I planned to comment also on the written paper. I probably won't do that now because the audience did not read the paper. My understanding is that the paper that you didn't really talk about, John, is an umbrella paper. It's very much, the first part is very much an IR paper. And in a nutshell, what it says, it wants to promote a new approach to a post-Western IR theory with a post-colonial lens. And for me, the core of that is that it should enable us, empower us to take seriously the voices, the discourses, and the practice of the local population, local people, localities, which is something that, for very strange reasons, typical peace-building literature doesn't do, with some exceptions. But it's not there, and partly because the peace-building literature is normative, or prescriptive, or it is so much in love with criticizing things that they actually forget to take a look at what's going on the ground, and that is not what you're doing. That's why I really like that. So I skip now to the second part of the presentation, the hands-on, David's paper. I have five comments to share with. One is about conceptual clarity. The second one is about modes of governance. The third one is about the sources of that new model. You say it's a new model of peace building, the sources of that model. The fourth comment is on the resources. And the last one is about the preferences of the local population locally. It's 5 comments. But before I do that, so the paper makes a really bold claim, and you were much more modest in the presentation, but the paper makes a bold claim. And the claim is that there's a new model emerging, a model of illiberal peace or authoritarian conflict management. It's already there. It's something that has emerged in terms of practices, in terms of discourses, in terms of norms, and it's sufficiently emerged so that we can start to think about it. So that's quite a bold claim. And then you go on and say, and this new model has 3 sources. One source is the increasingly visible contestation at high politics, the UN Security Council, where you had those with the norms of the liberal peace fighting those with other norms, mainly Russia and China, but other powers as well. And we see this contestation, and there's a crack in the system. So that's one source. A second source is that this new model has actually been applied by some of the rising powers, by Russia and China, and we can study how it has been applied. And the third source is the observation that many of the peace building, the liberal peace building missions and operations, have actually not produced a liberal peace, but have more led to a sustained status quo, which is illiberal. So the 3 sources of the new model. And then David's paper takes the umbrella paper very seriously and says we have to look now at and take seriously non-liberal thinking, non-liberal norms, non-liberal practices. That's what the paper does then. So my first remark or suggestion is I think there's much to be gained in terms of conceptual clarity if you compare the examples of illiberal peace building that we have with other historic examples. So one question I would ask you to answer, for example, is in what ways is illiberal peace building in Sri Lanka, in Tajikistan, or in Rwanda, different from the kind of conflict management that the Soviet Union actually used in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia? Was this the first wave of illiberal peace building, or is it something new? It is perhaps something new, but there's something to gain from that, right? The other question is it different from civil wars that authoritarian states were fighting? Is it different? Is it new? And we've had authoritarian states in Latin America, partly in Southern Europe, certainly in Africa. They were fighting civil wars. They were winning civil wars. With their approach to conflict management different from what you are describing now, right? And if the frame of the paper, that's probably the crucial point here. The frame of your paper, the reference, is very much to liberal peace. Yet the liberal peace is something that is typically applied to international and peace-building missions. So it's international, right? The examples you're using is domestic. So I would think there's a lot to be learned if we could construct comparisons between, illiberal international peace building. Do we have examples of illiberal international peace building? I could think of Russia and Tajikistan for sure. That is international. Maybe Cuba and Angola. Maybe South Africa and Mozambique. So there might be some historic cases of illiberal international peace building. That's a useful set of comparison for you. The other useful set of comparison is actually domestic liberal peace building, right? Because liberal peace building, as we use it, is internationally. But there may be examples of domestic liberal peace building. So peace building within democracies. I could think of Israel as an example. Sri Lanka used to be an example until something went crucially wrong. India is an example, and most prominently maybe Colombia, right? Northern Ireland, yes. So these are examples of peace building, in liberal peace building domestically, and most of them went really badly wrong. There's something to think about here, right? So that's the first remark. Your frame of reference and your historic examples may be expanded. A second point is very short. You mentioned that part of the model is a sustainable mode of governance, and I was just wondering, and you were then very, very sparse in the paper. I was wondering whether there's the only mode of governance that illiberal peace building has is the Kadyrov model, or maybe there are different models, or had you just the Kadyrov model in mind? Maybe the difference, right? My third point is also relatively short. You have mentioned 3 sources for the emergence of the model. I was wondering whether we could add a few more sources why this model might be emerging. One is, for example, the whole international community is still in shock because Iraq collapsed and Syria collapsed, and some people now tend to think or start thinking that maybe it's preferable to have stable autocracies that can, contain their own conflicts, if the alternative is a collapsed state with the rise of chaotic radicals. Maybe that just increases the appetite or the tolerance for illiberal peace-building model. A second source, well, that's the same source, so collapsed state and then the threat from radicals. A third source maybe, I think in my view, there's clearly a disappointment among Western international community with elections and democracy, because it hasn't really worked, right? It hasn't really worked. It has been tried in many places, but elections just do not solve any problems. They are valid in itself, but elections did not contribute to any kind of peace building in Afghanistan or Iraq, for example. So there's a growing disappointment in the West, which may also increase the tolerance for illiberal peace building. And then the fourth is more difficult, but if you read the mainstream discourse of international development actors, what you find is there's increasingly the notion that local ownership is what really matters. These processes should be endogenous. We shouldn't impose solutions, right? And if this is true, then that involves a growing respect for endogenous solutions, which are very often not liberal, but illiberal, right? So there may be a kind of, a hidden source for that. My fourth comment is about your resource section. I bought the space section, I bought the discourse section very much, so I was not entirely convinced by the resource section. I was convinced by the resource section, but my problem with the resource section is what you're describing as part of the illiberal peace building. You have networks, and then you have resources, and the trick is to funnel those resources to those networks which are supporting of the state and exclude the rebels and so on. But that is the same model also in every developing country and in every country that has been an addressee of liberal peace building. It's the same in Afghanistan, which is very much liberal peace building. It was the same in Kosovo, it's the same in Bosnia. It's just a matter of life. It's just a matter of fact that's been done. So that's not enough to distinguish liberal from illiberal peace building, I think. And, and that probably links to my last point, which is about the preference of the locals or the local elites. And I really, really appreciate the fact that you're taking local voices, local practices very seriously. What I was thinking is your project very much focuses on the supply side of peace building. We had tons of supplies for a liberal model, and now we're starting to have supply for an illiberal model. You could also think about the demand side. And if you think about the demand side, you would probably find that in many places, for very different reasons, there's simply not much demand for the liberal solution. Which does not mean that all of these, the local elites that do not embrace liberal solutions, but more embrace illiberal solutions. That's not a normative statement. It's a statement about the fact that many elites in countries like Afghanistan, or Iraq, or Rwanda, or elsewhere survive because their only mode of governance are patronage networks and rentier seeking. And because they are depending on patronage networks and rentier seeking, when internationals coming and say, we're going to give you that amount of reconstruction money and that package of good governance, but you have to do this, elections, good governance, anti-corruption, and so on. That is the same as saying that let's gamble with your political future. Let's abolish your networks of patronage. Why would they do so? They don't, right? Which is why they subvert mimicry and metis all over again, but they will subvert that push from the internationals. So I think one really important dimension to think on, to add on, is the demand side of local elites and their preferences. I stop here.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks to Discussants for those terrific comments. So I'm going to ask David and John to hold off in their responses, just so we can reward you and bring you in. You've been so patient through this discussion, and then maybe if you don't get a chance to address these issues, now you can do so in your wrap-up comments. Can we maybe turn on the lights now that we don't have presentations? We'll do that here. So let's, thanks, Becca. Let's take some questions. Just if you just step up to the mic, perfect, and just tell us who you are and who you're affiliated with, and who your question might be for.
Thank you so much for presenting your research. As an undergraduate junior at Cooley University, it's a really great honor just to hear the implications and also think about, if I want to go into this as a professional career too. So thank you for invigorating spark of hope from a student. So I have actually two questions that I'd like to address to either David or John. My first is in regards to the failures of the liberal piece and whether or not you believe that the research indicates this is something systemic or predicated upon problems inherent in the goal of liberal peace itself, or manifests itself through implementation problems that might also occur in authoritarian reforms as well. Because I believe this touches upon Professor Autesserre's point, as if we were to examine micro-level dimensions of actual actions implemented on the ground, would we see similarities in problems of implementation as well?
Be effective conflict managers.
Yeah, no, the second question is a really good one. I'm not really, I feel like, the Chinese Communist Party has its own think tanks that can probably come up with better modelling than I can. That's certainly, obviously, not the idea. I think one of the interesting things about this is, of course, that it's not an articulated model in the way that the liberal piece is articulated, right? If you think about the entire sort of discursive production of liberal peace building through, the enormous literature, the UN documents, and everything else, obviously this doesn't compare. But there are, I think, interesting conversations going on, among, say, a certain group of Sri Lankan intellectuals, perhaps, and military officers, who have talked to their Russian counterparts and have started to discuss this in a way that goes beyond the immediate domestic environment and the immediate sort of military tasks of seizing ground and defeating the enemy, right? So it's clearly not articulated at that level of being something that can be, if you like, rolled out through Russian think tanks or the Chinese Foreign Ministry. Clearly not, and it's clearly contested within each of these countries as well, right? So it's not an easy sort of package that has universal support. But I think there's more there than just this happened in this country, this happened in this country, and they're all very different, right? So there's some kind of model there. The question of why liberal peace fails, I don't know, maybe John has some thoughts on that. For me, it's not just about implementation, it's also about the conceptualization that simply doesn't work in many particular political situations. It's a big discussion of whether it can work. I think it can in some places. Second sort of question of that, of course, is what do we mean by success and failure? Is Bosnia a failure because it hasn't produced a sort of sustainable domestic political environment, or is it a success because Bosnians are no longer killing each other? I think this depends a lot on your sort of political philosophy, and a lot of liberal peace programs simply had these remarkably high targets of success that were never going to be achieved, right? You were never going to get liberal democracy in Afghanistan over a 10-year period, right? So it may be that we should think in more interesting ways about failure and think from the very beginning of a peace process, how is it going to fail? How can we make it fail in a slightly less disastrous way? But international organizations didn't think like that. So,
I'll just go briefly on the inherent problems of the liberal peace. I mean, I think there were and are inherent problems in thinking liberally or in liberal terms about space, discourse, and economics, actually. So if we sort of think about David's conceptual terms and think about them in terms of how they appear in the liberal piece, the attempt to create a liberal and open discursive environment, the attempt to actually generate public space where all actors and movers can take place, the attempt to sort of adopt market reforms and privatization. So liberal politics and economics, there is a fundamental flaw there, which is the lack of actors that want to share that space in an environment which remains highly tense, highly conflictual, and where dominant actors tend to sort of seek enforced sort of compromises, perhaps through something much more, as Christoph was talking about in his comments, clientelistic, where there's sort of patron-client ties that hold that together. So that is a fundamental error, and I think part of the response, really, and David's framing, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, David, is trying to look at, some of the practical outworkings of what's happened. So, you have a privatization initiative, but it works out precisely in the way that Christoph was talking about in his comments. But there can be some actually conscious manipulation of those processes by actors in more or less authoritarian terms, and therefore we have this practice-based model of authoritarian conflict management. And it's really David that's developed this in our project, so I don't want to read too much onto what you're doing, but I think the way we've discussed it has been more or less like that, you know, as a practice-based model.
I was wondering if I could also get Severine and Christoph's thought on this very important point about taking stock of the liberal model. Is this still a useful referent for a project like this in general? Where do you see it being challenged? And Severine, I'd be particularly interested in hearing your thoughts on Christoph's point about how this might appeal to local actors more, right? Or might just resonate domestically like, yeah, you know, this solved the problem, right? You know, Viking terrorists go home kind of thing. Or maybe not on that one, but.
Right. So on the appeal to local peoples, yes, Christoph, that was a fantastic point. It's one of the things when I'm doing research that I'm constantly struck by is, so again, Rwanda is the best African example that we have of authoritarian conflict management. But being steeped in the international community's discourse that liberal peace building is the only good thing to do, I'm always surprised when I'm meeting with Congolese friends and they're like, oh, look at how things are going well in Rwanda, and we want a Rwandan government. We want our government to be exactly like Rwanda. Like, you want your government to actually trample on human rights and kill political opponents and things like that. And yes, there is a desire, there is a demand for this kind of things for reasons that I haven't been able to understand and which I haven't studied anyway. But and on the liberal peace models, there is a huge literature on the implications and the internal failings of the models that I think Angel was referring to. But given that you gave me the floor, Alex, I'd like to push back on Angel's question, because I'm not sure that you really answered her question. I think what she was asking is, what are the normative implications of your project? And it's something, so, okay, we had a discussion with my class about your paper before coming here, and and that was one of the main things that was in the debate. The debate was, okay, but then, so what? So what's the practical implication of the project? Are you saying that authoritarian conflict management is maybe one of the ways to deal with the failings of the liberal piece? And my students had really strong normative and ethical and moral problems with this kind of implication. And again, I know that in the presentation and in the paper, you refrain from going that far and to talking about the practical implications. But given that we're among ourselves, that would be very helpful to hear more what you have and what are basically the normative and practical implications of the project.
Yeah, no, I think it's very good. It's a very good question and a very difficult question in all sorts of ways. Some of the initial part of this came from my dissatisfaction with the critique of the liberal piece, right? So although I understood, you know, the critique was often very powerful and understandable, as you know, people like Roland Paris have pointed out, the alternatives proffered by many of those critics are, you know, often illusory or vague or simply not grounded in practical reality, right? You know, the alternative to the liberal peace is always represented as a more emancipatory project, right? As more likely to produce social justice and peace. There's never a sense that the alternative to the liberal peace might be something much, much worse, right? So it started in a way with that, although I remain very critical of many of these liberal peace operations. So my idea is not to present this as an alternative model that will be ethically and indeed politically better. But there is a normative project here which is to try and get people to understand, and policymakers in particular, to understand why there might be demand for this, right? Why there might be people in Congo who think this is a great idea. Why there might be people in Kyrgyzstan who think, well, if only Putin could run our country, you know, he'd sort it out like he did in Chechnya. This kind of, this sense that order can be produced in a way that liberal interventions do not produce that. It's not to say that the liberal values that underlie that are not ones I don't agree with. I do agree with them. But I think they don't produce the effect that local people want in terms of order, security, and safety. In other words, all the things they're supposed to produce, they actually don't. So I this is not an attempt to say we need to drop all this liberal nonsense and produce, good old-fashioned, robust, just send in the boys and sort it out. No, this is really an attempt to try and maybe to produce some thinking around hybridization and certainly say, look, these are the failings of the liberal police. Here's a much more, if you like, sophisticated understanding of what emerges in its place. And we need to understand why that emerges, because it's clearly, these are gaps that we're seeing in our own processes that are being filled in various ways by these authoritarian approaches.
Look what you've stirred up. I think Christoph wants to get in, and then John.
Yeah, I'd love to, because I think it's a fascinating discussion about the liberal, illiberal piece. So, to start with, I think there's many people, including many Afghans, who would say today that they would rather be like Tajikistan than like Afghanistan. Tajikistan is not exactly liberal, but it has something to offer that Afghanistan has not, which is some modicum of stability and security. So much for your priorities. Whether the liberal piece has failed or not, I'm not a big fan of these labels, but if you take the label, I think the question is how you define success. I mean, if you look at the major peace-building operations after the end of the Cold War, they have been remarkably successful in bringing war to an end. There has very few cases have relapsed into war. They have been kind of, not overly, but a bit successful in at least establishing the raw basic fundamentals for democracy, so they're electoral democracies. They have been an absolute failure in terms of democracy, good governance, and non-corruption. It's up to you whether you say that's a success or not. The real question is, the real interesting thing is, if you look at these international peace-building missions, they come with so many resources and so much political pressure and so much diplomacy. But in so many cases, this massive international intervention are not able to nudge the local leads a little bit closer towards democracy. And why is this the case? And I think there's three reasons for that. One is if the intervention is too massive and too heavy and the footprint is simply too large, that will create a backlash. That has been the case in Kosovo, that has been the case to some extent in Bosnia, that has been the case to some extent in East Timor. So that's one mechanism. You can create backlash and you don't get your full good package of governance. The second, that's more important, is that there's even if the local leaders actually like democracy, and for example, Ashraf Ghani in Afghanistan, he's the perfect model of liberal peace building. He cannot do it because he would undermine his only mechanism for stability, which is patronage. Right? He cannot embrace that, and you will see that even Ghani will not be able to end corruption in Afghanistan, and even he will have to do pacts with very, very nasty non-liberal leaders. So, because it undermines governance, that is the second reason. And the third reason is simply fear. If many of those leaders, that's the case of Rwanda, they're simply scared of allowing more public space because of what happened before. That's also the case of Tajikistan. So that answers why there's not much demand for this international peace building.
Just to come in on the question initially and then Severine's challenge, I mean, I think one way of thinking about ethics is thinking about an alternative model that we can sort of buy into and then try and implement. Another way of thinking about it is the value and role in a descriptive and analytical model in revealing what's happening. So for me, the ethics here is about revealing the agency and consequences of something called authoritarian conflict management. Because there is a certain amount of witting use of these things, and when you close down discourse and space, it has very direct consequences. And I think Severine's challenge about violence is important, because violence is concomitant with this, and it's part of it too. It's something that we have looked at in a project David did refer to, but is not fully worked into the model. So there are very real consequences of this, and if this is a model, if it is a set of practices which have been adopted by authoritarian states, it has very, very brutal consequences, and Sri Lanka is the perfect example of that. We ourselves, to be honest, on the project, and there's some people in this room that are very well aware of this, experience very directly the consequences of information control and this closing down of space and discourse, because last summer one of our research team was arrested in Tajikistan and accused of espionage, and it was, so it brought very much home the sort of ethical issues around this, where, rather than having an environment in Tajikistan, which you did 10 or 12 years ago, where however corrupt and mildly authoritarian it was, you could do research and have NGOs talking about democracy and peace building. That clearly became impossible in Horog, where our researcher was in 2014, and he was arrested for that. So there's a thing going on there around about revealing how agency and how actors are operating. And there's a separate conversation then about, how is that a kind of necessary sacrifice, much in a way that counterinsurgency operations that sacrifice people's lives in order to achieve stability do that. So I think that ultimately is always the primary ethical imperative of academic research. It's providing a better account of what's happening so it can reveal the moral and questions around that.
Other questions? Yeah, please. Excellent, thanks.
Well, I first want to say thank you very much to both researchers and for the organization of this panel itself. I'm a senior at Columbia University in Severine's class as well. And I had a question regarding the organizational structure, especially at the UN level. So from my understanding, thinking about an illiberal peace, how does the UN structure maybe constrain the demands made by illiberal actors? Because oftentimes, even if we do understand them as having a sort of illiberal peace, the demands made don't often reflect what exactly, reflecting all the components of the illiberal peace.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. Yeah, how do the two interact if they're in the same space?
How does the UN and
Yeah.
the local...
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it is a really good question, and the second stage of the sort of discursive attacks in Sri Lanka, when moved on from Norwegians to attacking the UN, as also a sort of hotbed of unpleasant people who wanted to undermine Sri Lanka, and partly because the UN in Sri Lanka, took a stance to try and resist, try and investigate some of the alleged war crimes and try and understand what went on during the final months of the military campaign, right? So the UN can play a role in which it, as it were, resists various elements of this, including, for example, in the area of space, right? So one of the big areas of contestation in Sri Lanka was about humanitarian space. So each side within the conflict wants to control those resources in the way I was talking about and control this space and not have what humanitarian organizations in the UN were like, as a neutral space in which to push, to put through humanitarian aid. And so there was always this conflict between the UN and the government around who controlled the space that humanitarian organizations worked in, right? So there's always this moment of resistance between the two. In other cases, of course, the UN, you might say, shifts over to the other side. I've been assuming of you on Congo, for example, on the role of the UN. So there's some ambivalence there, I think, when you have more of a state-building process in which a UN peacekeeping force perhaps is working primarily with the state and with the government. So there's areas there of contestation. The UN, of course, is both a bureaucracy which has, the bureaucracies of, say, UN peacekeeping largely express these norms of liberal peace building. But then you have, of course, members of the Security Council who have very different views of what those norms actually mean in practice, or indeed have very different norms altogether. So you have this immediate tension within the UN structures themselves that obviously comes out when you get these major geopolitical clashes around Syria, Ukraine, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and everything else. So there's lots of tension within that whole process.
There's specific normative pushback on responsibility to protect, wasn't there, which we could talk about?
Yeah, so RTP is a great example of responsibility to protect, right, where you've had all sorts of ways in which the BRICS countries in particular have either resisted responsibility to protect or tried to reinterpret it in all sorts of ways, in the way that Amitabh Acharya talks about, of readapting and localizing this norm until it means something almost completely different, right? So it's a very interesting, maybe it's a response to sort of post-colonial thought as well, very interesting way of taking these norms, readapting them, and working out something very different. So if you look at, for example, Chinese discussions of what human security means, very interesting. You end up with a very different idea of what human security is in the original sort of cosmopolitan notion in the first place. It also is human security with Chinese characteristics, as it were. And so I think that's a very interesting process that's really worth thinking about.
So I want to ask one before I give you all 1 minute to sum up. And because at Harriman and at Saltzman, it's been all Ukraine all the time, I want to come and try and be objective. If I'm looking at this just based on sort of the liberal versus non-liberal model, right, on issues like discourse and information space and political economy, and I'm comparing the sort of Russian-backed sort of separatist attempt to carve out this sort of distinct sphere and normative space in the Donbass versus, international efforts to sort of stamp out the oligarchs, to transform Ukraine's patrimonial networks, introduce good governance and accountability, all these things, and it's not even resourced. I don't even think it's a contest, right? If these are sort of the dimensions on which one's going to win out in terms of what's going to be sort of, again, in terms of sort of producing political order in eastern Ukraine. And that's a very disturbing proposition, right? Just based, again, on the discussion that we're having here. So maybe if you want to address that, or maybe not, how about give you each about a minute, say max 2 minutes, then we really do have to wrap up. Yep, David? State?
Well, yeah, I mean, Ukraine, obviously, fascinating discussion we discuss about space and discourse in the Donetsk People's Republic. It's quite a nice paper title, isn't it? I think it's absolutely that sense of control, and absolute control, and a space that is very difficult for international agencies to penetrate, and the OSCE, one of the few. And, of course, look at the way economic resources are being controlled there, right? Channeled through these, more or less loyal individual on the ground. Look at the way Crimea is developing. That very local elite, a very localized elite. They're not sending in people to replace that elite, but using a local elite and channeling huge federal funds right into Crimea through these kind of systems. Look at the discourse around Crimean Tatars in Crimea. Right, very interesting ways of constructing a new political order that corresponds to what is appropriate within the Russian Federation, right? So I think there's a really interesting process going on there. And to be honest, the Russians are very far advanced, shall we say, in thinking through this notion of political order right along its borderlands. Look at, from South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Chechnya, DPR. These are all rather different, but nevertheless similar forms of governance that they're producing on their borderlands. Yeah. Really, thanks so much for the comments and feedback. It's far more than I can comment on here, but really, really interesting points. Question of violence is obviously fundamental to this, right? And you're absolutely right. I mean, I was definitely trying to get away from the idea this is just about violence and think about everything else around it. But I'm still thinking about how to incorporate violence in it. Clearly, violence, I do want to make the point that violence, I don't think, is an end in itself in these processes. Syria, for me, for example, is a process of authoritarian conflict management that has failed, right? And if you have that level of violence, then it's not working. So I think violence is a means to an end rather than a sort of definition of the process. But I think I'm still thinking about how to incorporate this. It's a really good point, though. All sorts of other good points there. What are the other sources of it? Christoph mentioned, you might call the failure of the Arab Spring. I think that's clearly influencing a new round of support for these rather more conservative and illiberal notions in international affairs. That's almost inevitable, I think, and it's simply adding to this sense in the West as well, perhaps, that these liberal approaches are simply not working in the interests even of the West. So all sorts of stuff there I'll take away, and we really appreciate that feedback. It's really great. Thanks so much. The point that there's lots of other parts of the world where this might be useful to look at. Rwanda is an absolutely fascinating case that certainly we'll look at as well as we go forward. Yep.
Yeah, just to reflect on Alex's challenge about Ukraine. I don't know a great deal about Ukraine, but I'm following it from afar, and I think there's there's definitely some hints there that some of the things that David was outlining in his conceptual framework are going on. I mean, obviously, and also I hope some of the things, well, not hope, but it appears some of the things that I was trying to get at, and Kat and I were trying to get at in the post-colonial relations between a rising power and a periphery which it controls, the mimicry going on in places like the Donetsk People's Republic, the taking on of Russian insignia, the sort of seeking to be part of Russia, the metis around things like the kind of practical strategies, the very informal strategies of exerting control, the use of proxies is clearly quite important. One difference here, of course, is Russia hasn't sought to formalize any kind of autonomy or even a kind of peacekeeping mission or something. It hasn't done the peacekeeping missions it had in Moldova or Tajikistan in the 90s and Transnistria as well, I think. And then I think clearly the use of some of the kind of corruption dynamics, political economy dynamics David was talking about, the pushback on discourse, and one of the interesting things appears to be the case where peace agreements and ceasefires have broken down, where there's been an attempt to try and share space. There's these zones under the borders of Ukraine and the Donbass region where, you said, well, this is a shared space, and then the rebels have pushed back and seek to control that because they need to dominate space, just as, you'd think of in terms of authoritarian conflict management. So we are thinking a bit more, I think, about where in other sort of peripheries of Russia there are things going on which are similar to what we're finding in Central Asia, and obviously, given the Ukraine conflicts that erupted during our project, then it's we do need to, I think, probably talk about that a bit more.
Great.
Just a 10-second on Christoph's point here. Is there another model except for the Kadyrov model? I think what we're seeing around those Russian borderlands is some real interesting differences emerging. That it's not just about Ramzan Kadyrov and his particularly interesting mode of governance, right? Which you can follow on Instagram, of course, with his daily updates. But you're seeing rather different processes, but still, I think, within this framework in which these are very high levels of control in all those different areas. So I think that's a really interesting process going on around those Russian borderlands, from Kyrgyzstan in the east right through to eastern Ukraine, and who knows where next.
Very interesting. Severine, final thoughts?
Sure. So your question on Ukraine, the way I understood it is that if we're in Ukraine now and we ask people what they want, the demand and the demand is going to be for short-term effectiveness. It's going to be for stopping the violence now. So we're going to have the demand is going to be for authoritarian conflict management. And I wonder if, when we take into account what we know about conflict management and about conflict peace building and everything we've been talking about today, I wonder if we're talking about the difference between short-term gains and long-term gains. Because we know that in the short term, authoritarian conflict management is usually more effective at controlling violence, at preventing overt violence on a very large scale, or at least that's the perception that I hear a lot when I'm on the ground, when I'm talking to people who are affected by violence. But at the same time, what we know as scholars is that in the long term, liberal conflict management is the best long-term solution to violence, and it's the best way to prevent violence from erupting in the long term. So then, if we're thinking about the policy implications, then the answer for your Ukrainian people would be, well, let's have authoritarian conflict management in the short term, and then use this authoritarian conflict management to democratize, and then build liberal regimes over the long term. But what we also know as scholars is that transitions, regime change, transitions to democracy especially, and especially big transitions from where you're going from a very authoritarian regime, which is usually what we need to have a good authoritarian conflict management project. So very authoritarian regime to a democratic regime, that's when you have the highest chance of having a civil war erupt. So it seems to be, again, we're looking at short-term versus long-term without any knowledge of how we could go from the short-term gains to the long-term gains.
Yeah, thanks for that. Christoph?
One thought only, resources. I have no idea, but I was just wondering and thinking now that we tend to think that liberal peace building are very, very costly. So much resource go to Kosovo, Bosnia, Afghanistan, and so on. But we have no idea, because we don't think about it, how many resources Russia has actually spent in Chechnya, and how many resources China actually spends in the Uyghur Republic. My thinking is it's considerably more. It's considerably more because if you factor in security forces and infrastructure and this and that, I think it might be actually more. And that may be one crucial difference between liberal and illiberal peace building. It's simply because one is done by the state, through the state, and by the state budget. It has even more resources, which adds to this very puzzling and very troubling thought of Alex that it's not even a contest.
All right.
And on that merry note,
Let's leave it there. So on behalf of Harriman and Solomon, thank you again for this wonderful discussion. Really, this is absolutely fantastic. And thanks to all of you for sharing your Tuesday evening with us. Thanks.